Hey everyone, and welcome to the final video for Chapter 21, where we'll be talking about the area in the Pacific Ocean, kind of collectively known as Oceania. Now, Oceania is a big area. You're basically talking about all the islands in the Pacific, from Hawaii up here, down through what today would be Indonesia, the Polynesian Islands, New Zealand, Australia. So you're talking about a very, very vast network with a number of different ethnic groups, but none of them really kind of established large state building. And that's why we kind of collectively take this entire area and clump it in as one, even though there is a fair amount of diversity there. Okay, so this is what, when you hear the term Oceania, you're kind of talking about the entire South Pacific. Now let's start off with the biggest island in the Pacific, and that is Australia. And as I said, Australia is big. Now this is a modern current map of Australia showing its different territories and its cities and so forth. And you notice that the largest urban areas are along its east coast, and particularly down the south. Right, that's where you have Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, and so forth. You don't have a ton in this whole, kind of central region. One of the main reasons that it's a largely desert climate, not very hospitable for humans. You've got some population areas up here as well. And going back into pre-European times, you had even less population centers because the only people living in Australia were the Aboriginal Australians. Now, they still make up a sizable portion of Australia's population today. But going back to pre-European times, they had very little contact with outside people. They had some contact along Australia's northern coast. They would have it with Indonesian or Malaysian traders, but not much. And this was largely because they maintained a nomadic hunter-foraging lifestyle up until the Europeans arrived in the 19th century. And even to this day, you'll have some of them that will continue to live in their traditional lifestyle out in the wilderness. They did trade with each other on a regular basis, as is common among nomadic people, but they were very much isolated from the rest of the world before Europeans showed up in the 1800s. Now, they practiced a very general religion. We would classify it as animism, kind of the worship of nature spirits and living in harmony with nature. And this is typical of hunter-forager societies who depended completely on their surroundings for survival. So while there is kind of a cultural tradition when it comes to music and song and language, there's not much in the way what we would classify, for civilization from Aboriginal Australians. Now, Pacific Island societies are a slightly different case. It's not that they created vast civilizations, but, still there were some very impressive achievements. Now, when we're talking about Pacific Island societies, the largest ethnic group, are the Polynesians. Now, Polynesia is an area that extends over thousands of miles and a lot of small little islands. From the east, you've got Rapa Nui and French Polynesia. To the north, you've got Hawaii, kind of smack dab in the middle of the Pacific. And then you go down here through Samoa, Tuvalu, Tonga, and then all the way down to New Zealand, which was the last major area to be settled by man around the year 500 CE. Right, so these were the regions that humans reached last. If they started in Africa and made their way through Europe and Asia and then across the land bridge and so forth, these regions were the most recent to be settled. Now they were able to remain somewhat connected, which was very impressive, through these island trade networks, especially around islands that were relatively, and I stress the word relatively, close together. I don't want to make it seem like they were very close together, but relatively close together. And this allowed goods to be exchanged, as well as some rulers to extend their influence over larger areas. Now, long-distance voyaging, I think, is the most impressive achievement of these Polynesian people. It made it possible for there to be contact with the Eastern Pacific. Contacts between areas like Easter Island and Hawaii possible. Hawaii is not near anything. I'll put a map in a second to show you guys kind of how it's smack in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. And there's even evidence that these mariners made it all the way to South America. They made it to the Pacific coast of South America, as evidenced by the cultivation of sweet potatoes on Pacific Islands. They're not native there. The only way they could have gotten there is by trade. So somehow guys on these islands made it all the way way to South America and then brought things back. What made it even more impressive was they weren't sailing in the large clipper ships that the Europeans were developing by the 14, 1500s. They were basically in these outrigger canoes, and they would set off just using the stars and the sun as their navigation tools for thousands and thousands of miles. You look at this map as a frame of reference. Here's Hawaii. It's 2,400 miles from California, 5,700 miles from Colombia, 2,700 miles from Tahiti, and there was regular trade between Hawaii and Tahiti in the 13th and 14th centuries. So guys would travel almost 3,000 miles one way just to do business and do trade. So really, really impressive what these guys were able to do with very limited means. But these were small islands, and so trade was really a necessity, plus travel was a necessity, because these small islands could exhaust their resources very quickly. And this became especially evident in the 14th and 15th century when you started to have some spikes in the population. By that time, the 14th and 15th centuries, cultivation of stable food crops such as bananas, yams, and as I said before, sweet potatoes, along with a lot of advances in fishing techniques, it led to increased population on the larger islands, such as the Hawaiian Islands, Samoa, Tonga, and so forth. And when you've got small islands like this, it leads to increased competition, and in some cases it got very, very nasty when they would run out of food. But it also led to job specialization, because now not everybody has to just focus on the basic farming, and some complex social classes. The complex social classes can then in turn lead to the development of ruling classes that held the status of high chiefs. Now, high chiefs were primarily military leaders, but they commanded tremendous respect on the islands that they ruled. This is an artistic rendition of King Kamehameha, one of the more famous and more recent kings in Hawaiian history before the Hawaiians were completely annexed into America. Now, they did practice their religion. It was a polytheistic religion. The importance of agriculture and warfare were reflected in that those were usually the most important gods. These were warrior societies. And individual islands worship gods that basically best suited their interest. So if you were in a particularly rough sea area in the Pacific, you worship gods of the sea. If you were in an area that didn't get a lot of rainfall, you worship to a god or goddess of rain in order to get more rain. Okay, so that's it on Oceania, and that also wraps things up for chapter 21, and then we'll get back into talking about the old world, on Asia and Europe with chapter 22, with the kind of the resurgence of trade networks.